Right, I'll get going. I think there's still some people coming in, but welcome everyone to this virtual event with Mark Carney, obviously former governor of the Bank of England, but now in Canada, but also he's the UN Envoy on climate action and finance and the finance advisor to the UK presidency of COP26. It's obviously been delayed by a year. This is our first event in a relaunched APPG on the environment. We have a new secretariat, Green Alliance. That's Chris Venables on the screen, who's the head of politics there, who's now in charge of secretariating the APPG. We've got an ambitious program of events over the year ahead, keen to really push forward debate and understanding of environment issues. And I just want to say thank you before we kick off to Robin Biles and Adrian Wilkes, who were the founding secretariat, who are now taking a bow after 27 years doing that. So thank you very much, Robin, who I see is on the line. So it's a real honour to have Mark Carney here. He's going to speak for 10 minutes or so about the green recovery. We hear a lot about it post-COVID. How do we build back better? There's obviously huge political appetite across the spectrum and around the world now to tackle climate change. And Mark Carney's been very outspoken about it, even when he was governor of the Bank of England, and is now dedicating his time for it. And he's agreed to speak for 10 minutes or so and then take questions. If you could, with the questions, put them in the chat, or indeed wave your hands and I'll try and see you, but I may not be able to see everyone at once. If you put them in the chat, I'll see them, then ask them, and I'll ask. We've got some pre-submitted ones, but I'll come to that. So I'm now going to hand the floor over to Mark Carney. Mark, we've got a huge opportunity here. Tell us about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, and thanks everyone for having me, inviting me into your homes and offices, and for all that you're doing for the dedication to these issues, whether over 27 years or more recently with the new secretariat. And welcome to the new secretariat, I guess. So what I wanted to do is just give a bit of context, and not surprising, I'm going to focus, it's going to be a little finance heavy towards the back end of my remarks because, as my very long title suggests, that's the focus that I have as part of COP, which is really a new part of the COP process, dedicated on the private finance side, and really getting the leverage out of private finance. But I want to tie it back directly into this topic of the green recovery. And I think the first thing is, we all have our own reflections of what we're living through now with the COVID crisis and the health crisis. But if you're from a financial perspective or a fiscal perspective, it really underscores first and foremost the importance of resilience. You can't wish away systemic risk. It's going to crystallize at some point. And there is no bigger systemic risk than climate change, which is part of the reason why you're part of the APPG. COVID, many things come out of COVID. It's often, the analogy is often we're all in the same boat. I think we're realizing maybe we're in the same storm, not in the same boat. There are disparities that are exposed in a variety of ways. With climate, we really are all in the same boat in a endless storm unless we address it. So importance of resilience, importance of acting in advance. The numbers are dwarfed. If you look at COVID preparations in many countries, it would have been a couple of days of lost output, lost GDP this year would have been the cost of some of the preparations there. Similar calculations on climate. Okay, that's the first point. The second, in terms of context, is for virtually every company, not absolutely everyone, but virtually every company, this requires a new strategy. There's a few e-commerce platforms, a few, the technology we're using that were on strategy coming in. It's reinforced by the dynamics of the crisis and the likely structure of the economy going out. But for virtually every other company, there's a requirement to reset the strategy coming out of this. And this is part of the big opportunity. If you're in the United Kingdom, if you're in Canada, if you're in 120 other countries around the world that have net zero as an objective, and of course in the UK it's a legislated objective, it's not just an aspiration, but a legislated objective, and your companies are all resetting their strategies, it is entirely reasonable to ask them, well, what's your strategy for net zero? Now it's possible, that a company's strategy, given the net zero horizon, is out to 2050 and a crunch in 2030, but out to 2050. It's possible, but that the answer to that question is, well, I don't have a strategy because I'm going to wind my company down by that point. That has the value of transparency. It could be right. It's part of the adjustment process. But not having a strategy, not having thought about it, will be increasingly anachronistic. And I think that's part, starting with our largest companies and starting with the financial sector, of what you can help shape coming out of this crisis. Now, turning to the policy side. I think when you think in broad terms, at least when I think in broad terms about the policy response here, first to recall that, of course, we're still in the health crisis. We're very much in the health crisis. This is the only way we can get more than 6 of us together at one time at the moment. And so there is fine judgments that still need to be made about the degree of emergency support to individuals and companies, and leave it to those of you on the front lines to make those judgments. But in that context, on the fiscal side, it probably does make sense to start to differentiate or to be clear about the differences between COVID spending, if you will, current expenditure, and capital expenditure. And of course, the capital expenditure can run from physical capital, with which we're all familiar, digital capital, human capital, natural capital, and the capital spending is the element of the fiscal response, which is going to have the biggest multipliers in terms of both GDP and jobs. And I suspect you're well familiar with it, but there is substantial evidence, case history, and other evidence that, broadly speaking, green jobs, sustainable infrastructure has much higher, it's more capital intensive, and it has higher job intensity and higher GDP multiplier effects. So in other words, indirect jobs that are created as a consequence from that. And that runs from home retrofits to energy infrastructure and natural capital as well, preserving vital parts of the UK's natural heritage. So there is a big fiscal element to it, differentiating between what's current, what's emergency, what's necessary, run rate, if you will, for the country as we come out of the emergency, and what is the capital that's being invested. It is commonly observed, and it's right, that we are operating in an exceptional period in terms of global interest rates. That's likely to remain the case for some time. That presents an opportunity in terms of spending, but it's not an unlimited opportunity. And of course, what's important is to have some sort of guardrail and fiscal framework around that. And I know the government will be thinking that through. All governments will need to think that through. So there's a big fiscal component. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But there are 2 other F's, and I guess that's part of my point here, is that the second F, I would, if I can alliterate, is around framing, and the third is around finance. Now, the framing side is regulatory policy and setting clear directions and credible and predictable pathways for regulation, for example, around electric vehicles, around fuel use, and other, hydrogen would be a third, where there is a sense of where the industrial structure is going, where the economy is going, and that will be one of the elements that will bring in our judgment, very large private investment multipliers. And then the third bucket, and I'm worried about my 10 minutes here, my third bucket is around finance, where I promised that I would go on longer. And it's just, if you give me, I'm going to take...
Carry on.
Okay. I'm going to take the opportunity to just underscore what we're trying to accomplish, the UK is trying to accomplish as part of COP26. And we're not waiting for COP26, we're trying to layer this into the financial sector. Anthony knows as well, layer this into the financial sector immediately. And I would underscore at the start that there is a lot of momentum around this agenda. The private sector, the city, Scotland, others are very engaged in these issues and really bringing their expertise to the table. So this is, you know, the more you can get behind this and support it, the bigger the impact is going to be there. But you're going to be moving with the flow. The objective is simple for COP on the private finance side, simple but hard, I guess I'd put it, which is to ensure that every private financial decision takes climate change into account. And obviously that's really starts with the professional financial decisions, but the essence of that is that professionals have the information they need to consider the impact of a company or an asset on that transition to net zero. And it becomes a natural way of judging the value of an asset or a company, just as credit risk is an input to evaluation judgment, or indeed in a macro sense where interest rates are going as part of the value judgment. So climate change becomes one of the core determinants of value of all assets. So what do you need for that to be the case? The first is you need information, you need the right disclosure around climate-related risks by companies. And that's not just, it starts with what's their carbon footprint or GHG footprint today, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but it also includes where it's going, where the company thinks it's going, that carbon footprint, and how they intend to manage it. And there's a discipline that's developing around that called scenario analysis. Now, all of this is wrapped together in some standards that were developed. I should be careful, they're not official standards, they're voluntary standards that were developed by something called the TCFD. As you well know, as members of the APPG, that climate change is the land of acronyms. And so the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, was headed by Mike Bloomberg, set up 5 years ago for Paris, delivered in 18 months these recommendations, and now you have 1,400 of the world's largest companies who are reporting against them, and $150 trillion of assets of all the major pension funds, banks, insurers, et cetera, asset managers who want this disclosure. So the point around this is the first building block information. There is a standard that's been developed. It works for the users of capital, companies, and the suppliers of capitals, all the investors and insurers and pension funds and banks. And now it's time for the public sector to take what is in the private sector and is being applied, pretty well, but not universally, and move it in on a path to becoming mandatory. Okay, and so that's one of our objectives for COP, is to make this a global reporting standard, and make it have a pathway to making it mandatory. There's various ways to do that. Some countries will do it in legislation. Other countries will tie bailout aid, I shouldn't say bailout aid, emergency support to these standards. Canada did that. I'm using Canada as an example there. France has done some of that as well. But we're getting the securities regulators, so people like the FCA and others, to commit to do this, and the actual accountants are now, and this is pretty radical, the accountants are shifting from just financial disclosure to sustainability disclosure. And there's, some of you would know, there's an umbrella body called the IFRS, which oversees that for basically everywhere but the United States, and they're picking this up. So there will be determinations for you as parliamentarians around, there's some legislation around pension funds, whether or not they would require companies to have this information. There's consideration within the UK context, and I don't want to dictate, there's a variety of ways to do this, but how should we get on this pathway so our largest companies across the board are reporting the information that ultimately investors and all of us need to judge who's on the right path towards net zero. That's the first big bucket, reporting information. The second is around risk and developing a risk management capability within our banks and insurers to think about climate risk. And the issue here for banks particularly is their time horizons tend to be out about 5-7 years. When they make a loan, mortgages are an exception, but in general, corporate loans are shorter term, and they are they will mature before the most difficult, physical manifestations of climate change come into play. This is the tragedy of the horizon. So the point being that they don't necessarily have to take that into account unless, I mean, there's some exceptions in terms of certain sectors, but unless they think that, if I can put it this way, your policy is credible. In other words, we don't just have a 2050 standard for net zero, but gradually regulatory policy, carbon pricing, consumer attitudes, which obviously you don't control, but the combination of those will mean that companies that are not part of the solution to getting to net zero will be either uneconomic because of regulation or carbon pricing, or because of consumer demand. And that's so-called transition risk. So it's not the physical manifestation of climate change, but it's the transition from where we are today to where we need to get to. That's what banks need to learn to judge and bring that from the sort of medium to long term into the immediate. Now, how do we get them to do that? Well, the Bank of England and 18 now other central banks around the world are stress testing, or in the process of stress testing their banks and insurers against climate risk. And basically what they say is freeze your balance sheet today. And what does that balance sheet look like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, if we're on a path to net zero with policies consistent with that, carbon prices and other policies consistent, or if we're business as usual and it's mounting physical risk. And in other words, is your strategy robust as a bank? The people you lend to, the sectors you're developing your business with, is that robust to what the country intends to do? In most cases, the answer is going to be no. And so that prompts a strategic question. Well, what do you do as a bank to go from the lending profile you have today to the one that you're going to need over time? So it's a different form of stress test for those of you who follow, the stress tests that came after after the financial crisis, which were really about building up capital in the banks. This is about thinking through strategy with them. That's pretty crucial. It's kind of behind the scenes plumbing stuff, but it's about developing an expertise. And so for COP, what we're doing is we're building this approach with as many central banks as possible. And with the Banque de France and the Netherlands Bank formed a group of 70 central banks around the world, covering about 3/4 of global emissions that are helping to develop this expertise. And so we want as many of them in their own way, adopting this type of approach. The last bucket, so that's risk, reporting risk, and the last bucket to help ensure that, quote, every financial decision takes climate change into account is around returns. So in other words, how can we tell whether our pension fund or our unit trust or or a bank, if we have our savings in a bank or a building society, whether or not that money is being put to work consistent with the transition to net zero? What type of transparency is required in a way that is understandable for everybody, whether again they're part of the problem or part of the solution. And historically, or not just, and the history isn't that long, but there are things like ESG ratings or kite marks that have developed. There's some utility to those, but an ESG rating, which looks at environmental, social, and governance issues, the environment piece is often dominated by the social and governance pieces. So in terms of who has a good rating, that's a good thing for society as a whole, but it doesn't tell you the answer to climate change. So what we're doing on that is to work with the private sector to develop techniques like as simple as just what proportion of their assets have transition plans. A good question. That's a moving target now, and moving in the right direction. To actually, if the economy looked like their portfolio, where would the temperature be by the end of the century? So the warming potential of the portfolio, and obviously the higher it is, the more challenging. For what it's worth, calculations for the market as a whole the answer to that is about 3.5 degrees of warming, which you as APPG members would kind of intuitively know from other analyses, but it's it's a sobering statistic. The more that's clear and the more that's attached to specific pools of capital, the more the responsibility comes to manage that accordingly. Last point, and then I'll hand back to you, Anthony, and questions. There's one other initiative I want to make you aware of. It's early days, but it relates to so-called nature-based solutions and carbon offset markets. So we're all familiar with offsets. This world is, for all the profile it sometimes gets, it's a relatively immature market. It's fragmented. It's small. There's only about $300 million of offset trades in a year. The prices vary from sort of less than $1 to $70. The quality is variable again, and it needs to be professionalized. This is a market that, as companies develop these net zero plans, this is a market that should be measured in the tens of billions of pounds of flow per year. And so we have struck a working group chaired by Bill Winters, who's many of you would know, who's the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, and led by Annette Nazareth, who used to be one of the commissioners at the Securities Exchange Commission in the US. It's a global group. It's soup to nuts, from the plumbers to mix my metaphors, from the plumbers to the banks, to the asset managers, to the companies who need these offsets, to a variety of NGOs. And they are charged, this group is charged with coming up with a blueprint for this market by the end of the year. And then we will look at it from a COP perspective and see whether or not to develop it into a pilot. It could be this could be incredibly important. It's been a difficult issue that hasn't been solved thus far, but it's one more sign, and this is my last sentence, of the momentum that's around this, and that you can get the right people around the table now to say, okay, we need this market. How do we crack it, and do it in a time frame that's consistent with the urgency of the issue. Okay, sorry, Anthony, it was more than 10.
That's great. That was 25. That's absolutely fascinating, and a great overview of the scope of the ambition here, really to realign the whole financial sector to price in net zero and to sort of align with that ultimate objective. We've got quite a few questions coming in. I just have one to start with. I'll use my sort of chair's position here. You mentioned on the reporting standards that some countries will legislate and so on, and there's the IFRS taking it on board. Presumably a lot of what you're doing, it will require other forms of legislation from national governments, or are there things that would happen naturally anyway as banks become more aware of climate risk and who they're lending to, not having a strategy for it, etc. And as you say, all companies will have to have a strategy for it, and investors will start demanding it anyway.
Yeah, I think there are, and where I'm going to be a bit fuzzy is there's whether we go the legislative route on issues, as you just flagged, on reporting, or whether other mechanisms are effective. So I think the judgment I take on reporting in the UK at this stage is, well, we want all our large companies to meet these standards of reporting. We want to bring the world along with us, but the world's going to get there, so we want to be there. There's a few mechanisms. One, there's using the FCA as the regulator and some form of comply or explain. That's a sort of soft mechanism, and they have a consultation paper or consultation process, which is now, I think, complete on that. There's using the stock exchange. Doesn't capture all the private companies, but using the stock exchange as a listing requirement. Again, something that's being looked at. There is ways, though, that in terms of, I mean, one of the questions, I guess, which I'm going to just move slightly adjacent to what you asked, Anthony, is around ongoing support to industries. And part of the point of ongoing support to industries, and I'll just say generically, and we all know that COVID is, it's an asymmetric shock. It hits some industries brutally and others, to a very limited extent. The extent to which there's ongoing support, the expectation in general is that those industries will ultimately be viable again. But if they're ultimately going to be viable again, having the right reporting and having a transition plan would seem to be necessities. And so linking that to the support isn't entirely reasonable, in my judgment. One always gets want to be a little careful about putting too much linked into the support, but it's entirely reasonable. Otherwise, it's support for an industry that is being wound down. And if it's going to be wound down, you might as well just admit that so that it can be judged accordingly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come first to the way I'm going to handle questions. Actually, I'm going to ask a couple of people just to ask the questions themselves, and then it's probably just in terms of time quicker if I read the other ones if people put them in. But I'm going to come first to Jerome Mayhew, MP for Broadlands, who actually was the first person to put in a pre-written question. Jerome, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Carney, for your comments. Of your three tools for transition, you talked about regulation, carbon pricing, and consumer demand. Dealing with carbon pricing, carbon taxation has been around for a long time, but one of the real problems is for international carbon taxation. So border adjustment payments, at the moment, they are politically unacceptable. How do you make the leap to make those politically acceptable and realistic?
Yeah, it's a very good question, very topical question. I think that we are likely going to see different degrees of climate ambition as in COP26. The Prime Minister's objective, the UK's objective, is absolutely for a high ambition COP, and that's why it was postponed until November 2021, was to make sure that that would be. But that said, there are different starting points, and there probably is going to be variance. And that variance in ambition, to your point, will lead for some industries to risks of being at a competitive disadvantage because certain countries are moving faster, which leads to potential need for border adjustment tariffs or border adjustment mechanisms. As you would know, the EU has signaled fairly clearly that they will consider that, or they will pursue that, maybe a better way to put it, for so-called hard to abate sectors. So think steel, cement, some of the big industrial sectors where this would be the case. And it is, it's a legitimate mechanism. The trick will be to make it, WTO consistent. I think it's possible. In the spirit of adjustment, and I think in the spirit, not just the spirit, in the realities of commerce, it doesn't have to be perfect. So it doesn't have to perfectly equalize the ambition, because the thresholds of outsourcing your cement or steel, they're not calculated to the pence. But my personal view is this is coming, and so what we need to do is to think about, there's some number of design issues around it, think about where it would be targeted, work, including with the European Union and others, to get a acceptable mechanism for it, and in that, right, the other thing is, in that, my view would be, and this is part of the challenge, is you're mixing, in terms of climate ambition, let's say carbon prices. It's not just about the carbon price, it's about the other mechanisms as well. If you have regulatory or other restrictions and a lower carbon price, you may have a carbon price equivalent level of effort that's close enough, and so those judgments do need to be made. But that's a very long answer but it's a very good question. The first bit is, I do think it's coming, and so work on that, on design issues, and having at least a coalition of countries that see this as a legitimate mechanism will be important.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions on TCFD, which you obviously talked about. And first from Nick Lakin at Kingfisher, who's I'm not sure if it's on the call, I hope so. Basically, they're doing a lot of work on TCFD themselves. The concern is whether there's a level playing field on it. That some companies will be digging very deep on their TCFD duties and doing a lot of research, putting a lot of effort into it, whereas others will just discharge their TCFD obligations by doing very little. So how can you ensure a level playing field on this? And some companies aren't disadvantaged by it.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, it's a very good question, and this is what this is a core of what we're trying to get across, which is that to bring it from voluntary private, which, to be candid, allows that level of disparity. So someone can produce a TCFD report, but not meet the, not do the scenario analysis, not do scope 2, scope 3, not necessarily disclose how or if compensation is tied to the attainment of the various climate outcomes, et cetera, all elements of the TCFD. So that's why it needs to be brought into the formal reporting frameworks. And the reason I talk about various ways is, COP being a global process, different countries will do this in a slightly different way, but it needs to be formalized. In the European Union, so of interest, but not directly relevant here, there is effectively a sustainable, it's called FRAG, I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's basically a sustainability disclosure project that is based off of the TCFD for climate. It's broader sustainability than just climate. So that's being brought up through the TCFD. The IFRS has just announced, they're in consultation, but they've announced they are going to have a whole approach to, quote, sustainability disclosure, which again is broader. That's ESG. But the first thing they're going to work on is climate, and they'll base it off of TCFD. And so we will have, fingers crossed, it will take a few years, IFRS standards. Ideally, the securities regulators are picking that up as well. So we have securities regulator standards, IFRS standards in Europe, regulated standards, again, of interest, but not directly relevant to the UK. And those are the three ways you turn things from, select from this menu, which wasn't what the TCFD says, but what some companies do, to this is what the disclosure has to be on sustainability, and that's what mandatory gets us. And just if I for those who don't want to dive into the details, the signal I would give to the APPG is the private sector's taken this far enough. Questions like Nick are one of the reasons why we need to then say, okay, what's our route in the UK to making this mandatory?
Thank you. So we've got a question from Andrew Day here. I see he's on the line about TCFD as well, but really about the sanctions. So where the carbon, Andrew, I can see you're there. Do you want to ask the question directly yourself?
Thank you, Anthony, and hi. Where the carbon solvency of a company is not clearly defined, i.e. by TCFD, should shareholder dividends be withheld to ensure the organisation transitions into a carbon solvent, long-term sustainable future?
Great question. So carbon solvency, I mean, that's a term that's not in the mainstream, but I know what you mean, or I think I know what you mean. And that's that's part of what transition plans from companies, net zero transition plans, will hopefully, combination of current TCFD disclosure and the transition plan for the company will get to. Now, there is a question, as with anything when it first develops, there's a question of, well, what's a good transition plan and what should it entail, right? And just like with TCFD disclosure, there's going to be a wide range in terms of the quality of these as they come out. Obviously, the scope 3, getting to scope 3 emissions as a base, for your transition plan is an important start. Having short-term metrics and milestones that are matched against that is necessary so it can be tracked. Saying how it's governed and whether or not any compensation is tied to the achievement of those milestones is also useful as well. I'll give you my personal bias, I guess, on this is, I think the important thing at this stage is to say you have to have a transition plan and get companies to judge what they think is right for their transition plan. And remember, I said at the start, my transition plan in a certain sector, I don't want to pick on a specific sector, but a certain sector, or just the nature of my business, it could be, I'm going to wind it down. I'm going to run it off in the next 10 years because I don't think it's going to be economic beyond that. And that's an entirely, that's a legitimate transition plan. It might be a little painful to say, but That's part of the reallocation of the economy to a more sustainable economy in all senses. So I wouldn't, aside from sort of high-level aspects, my personal view, not my decision at all, but my personal view, I wouldn't dictate too much more in terms of what the transition. You want to see what the company thinks it needs to do and intends to do. But the last point is that there are a number of people who think that there should be an advisory say on transition, just like there's a say on pay. So, as you're probably familiar, for public companies, there is annual shareholder vote, which is advisory, but it carries a lot of weight on compensation arrangements. So one way to do this is just the requirement for transition plans, whether that's social pressure or it's legislated or some other regulatory requirement, but without dictating exactly how they should look, and then having a say on transition, which allows the market to determine whether these are credible and effective.
Thank you. Got a question from Fiona Harvey. I can't see whether she's on the call. I'll read it out. A lot of your comments have been based on, or clearly targeted towards companies in the private sector with investors and so on. Her question is, most fossil fuel assets in the world are not owned by publicly listed companies, but national oil companies, and so not subject to stock market rules, etc. How do you get these national oil companies around the world to respond to climate change?
Well, there's a couple of ways. One is you're partly getting the demand for energy to respond for climate change, and having an energy policy in the UK in the medium term, an energy policy, a transportation policy, ground transportation, heavy haulage, air transport, maritime. All of those are part of the policy framework. All of those will affect ultimate oil demand here. The national oil companies do have a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them do have listing requirements and other requirements which involve the disclosure. I mean, I think even, I shouldn't say even, but Aramco, who's the largest example of that, has a recognition, having had a number of conversations with them about it, both about the energy transition. They feel pretty good about their position in the energy transition, given not just the cost of their oil, but the low carbon intensity of their oil. And of course, that's part of the question that just basically is being asked of virtually every entity, whether it's public or private, is on the energy side, is what's your view of the transition and where do you fit in? So it comes, so to resume or to summarize, it's partly on, largely on the demand side, which is the industrial transformation that needs to happen. That's part of it. But then there are other ways, as these companies touch the global capital markets, that they would be subject to it, that they raise debt in the United States or Europe, which they often do. Then that has the impact. Or if they're listed, partially listed somewhere globally, that has the impact. But then lastly, it's more in their minds than might appear, at least in terms of public discourse, at least in my experience.
Thank you. It's got a question from Judith Batchelor, who I can actually see on the line. I don't know, Judith, if you want to ask the question yourself or...
Oh, yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Mark, for the conversation. I think the whole thing is fascinating, but incredibly complicated. And I would call myself a simple practitioner in this. And I work for Sainsbury's, the retailer. Some of the work that we're trying to do, whether it's on basic carbon reporting or even something like managing the scenario analysis you talked about earlier, proves quite challenging to us from a data perspective, particularly when you start to look at carbon footprinting of a complex business like ours, where our footprint is in our scope 3 emissions by country mile. And I just wondered whether there were any plans for the provision of a universally approved database. And it goes back to the earlier point, I think, that was made about a level playing field and how we can make sure that, particularly comparing like with like, not just for our own management information and our transition plan, but clearly for investors and analysts. I realise that's a bit of a question, sorry.
No, questions, not just about rules, it's about the actual, how you actually do the measurements.
Yeah, no, it's, well, and, you know, part of the answer is not to be prisoner of the rules, but part of the answer is in universal or broader application of the rules. So the more that what Sainsbury's is putting on their shelves or delivering to our doors, the more that that product has its scope 1, scope 2 emissions. And in fact, you know, it's, I mean, I noted the Citizens Assembly was the various recommendations of the Citizen Assembly included carbon footprint of you know, the food we consume, the packages, or the, you know, the products we consume in terms of labeling, which is a possibility. There are, I don't want to be, so the short answer is the broader application of the rules will make it easier to do scope 3, not entirely, because there's a big chunk of the, you know, smaller trade or private sector that makes it tough. And then you have to, Judith, I'm sure you're having to do a lot of estimating based on sector. Secondly, there are these social pressures that could come, and they would come more early, or they would come earlier probably in the UK than elsewhere. And we see evidence of that in the Citizens Assembly. And then the third thing to be, and then I'll mention it because it's not like turnkey ready to go, but from a technological perspective and from a data perspective, you know, the move ultimately to single item labeling, single item barcode. So, you know, this pen, like this, literally this pen, not this type of pen, has its own barcode. That creates the linkages. I mean, it's slightly Orwellian in some senses, but it creates the linkages through everything in the supply chain. And if the carbon is measured at each point, then it's actually very easy to aggregate. That's not tomorrow, but it's some of the building blocks, particularly the software around that, do exist today and are based in the UK, I might add.
Okay, thank you very much for that very full answer. Question here from Sophie Laurie, and I can't see whether she's on the call, so I'll ask the question for her. From UKRI NERC, reporting on nature-related assets is likely to be more complex than climate reporting. Does the working group have a sense of research gaps that might be needed to be filled to support this?
It's a great question. In terms of the group that I'm heading for COP, it's not something we're looking at directly. It's a short answer. I think the Dasgupta review that Partha Dasgupta, the Nobel laureate, that he's doing for the Treasury, the interim review was out a few months ago. Final is due, I think, by the end of the year. This is part of what they are looking at. There's an important report coming out next week by the Paulson Institute. Hank Paulson, the former US Treasury Secretary, actually it might be this week, now that I think about it, it might be Thursday, is coming out around some of these issues around pricing, quote unquote, natural capital. And it is part of the, it is absolutely an area for research and an area for development. One of the challenges, just flag one challenge, which is the pricing, you know, how apples to apples is a pound value of a forest versus a pound value of a pen in my example. And so you can get, well, this, what I was going to lay out is a higher class problem. The real issue is actually being more diligent about having some estimate of the value of nature and tracking that over time. And if I can link it back, and then I'll hand back to you, Anthony, link it back to the fiscal or the response to the COVID response, the topic today, the COVID response, over the medium term, you know, some of the spend could be for natural capital, you know, for wetlands, for river systems, for reforestation, etc. Being able to have some valuation of that and tracking that value and how that changes over time, so you have discipline, you know, multi-generational or multi-decade management of natural capital would be incredibly valuable. And so, yes, it's a top priority for research. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We're due to finish at 2, which is about just over 10 minutes. So there's probably scope for a couple more questions if people want to ask one. I've got one here from Graham Godwin Pearson. Again, I can't see whether he's on the call. I'll ask you. You mentioned some of the wetlands there, etc. It's about agriculture. With the agriculture bill being discussed now, which in case you aren't following what we're doing in the UK Parliament, this is transposing the European Common Agricultural Policy subsidies into environmental support for farmers, which and is currently going through Parliament. With it being discussed now, should we be using subsidies to make unsustainable CO2-heavy intensive farming practices uneconomical in favour of traditional organic farming that's better for the environment than food security? I don't know if that's in scope for you or out of scope. Have any views?
Should we? I vote for supporting the unsustainable CO2 part. It's definitely a directional question. Well, these are. Listen, this is one of the the advantages of Brexit is stopping to look at huge programs such as the Common Agricultural Policies, elements of that, and is it fit for purpose and specifically for the UK, which is what you're doing, and then broader, out of the tragedy of COVID, there are these strategic resets for companies and for policy, and I'm glad to see that that they're being taken seriously. Yes, I'm not following the details of the agricultural bill, but now I will start paying closer attention.
For those of us who've been following the Common Agricultural Policy for decades, it's quite an exciting change. But one question I have: one of the concerns there was when the UK legislated to have the net zero by 2050 target was the impact it would have on the economy and GDP. And indeed, Philip Hammond, as Chancellor at the time, expressed public concerns about that. How, as we transition from a carbon-intensive economy to a sort of carbon-neutral economy over several decades, how big an impact do you think that will have on GDP and GDP growth? Do you think these scenarios of it really slowing down economic growth are merited, and presumably what you're suggesting, because you're aligning the financial system with that going to net zero, would actually reduce the economic costs of transition?
No, absolutely. So the first thing is to look at the counterfactual. Now, admittedly, a counterfactual on a global scale, and the UK is absolutely a leader in this, but can't deliver the globe. The GDP costs of, best as people can tell, or the scenarios around GDP cost of, business as usual is up, somewhere in the 25% of GDP level type effect. And that's not taking into account any natural capital loss, which isn't valued today, earlier question. It's not taking into account potential feedback loops and other productivity hits. And so it's a guesstimate, and it's only a guesstimate about a sliver of the potential costs here. And of course, these are, this is the curse that keeps on taking, right? It's not the gift that keeps on giving. You can't reverse it, absent some, it's barely in science fiction, geoengineering that can be, come up with. So, the stakes are very high in that regard. Now, first best for GDP, for growth, for UK competitiveness, is a smooth transition towards 2050 from where we are. And that the UK moving a bit ahead of the rest of the world and particularly for the UK for high growth areas. And part of that is finance. I'll come back to finance in a second, but areas, around hydrogen, carbon capture, other aspects, certain materials, artificial intelligence, all of which will be big parts of the solution. Okay, so the UK gets out in front. These will have global applications. That's good. That's good for UK GDP. It's hard to exactly quantify it, but it's an opportunity. Now, where there is a big opportunity in services is around seeing where the world needs to go and putting money behind where it needs to go. So in other words, particularly in financial services. This, I said at the outset that you can have climate as one of the determinants of value, or rather the transition, where a company is on the transition to net zero is one of the determinants of value. All of a sudden, that throws a new way to look at a company. Some will be above the line, some will be below the line. Below the line is good, above the line is bad. But if you have a strategy, say like BP, an out strategy that they're going to move from above to below, there's potentially huge value creation there. The institutions in the city, in Edinburgh, wherever around the country, that can spot which companies are going to do that and support them and get out of the companies that aren't, are going to make a lot of money. They're just going to make a lot of money. And as they develop the expertise in seeing this, and also the expertise in risk management around climate, on the latter, they're going to save a lot of money, which is equivalent of making a lot of money, is one of the lessons of finance. Money saved is money made. And I do view this as, you know, if society is truly behind this, policy is credible, we're doing it smoothly, we'll have a higher growth trajectory in the UK than we would otherwise. And we have the opportunity to do it. And if I can, I know we're getting late in the day, but just to reinforce it, one of the most important things will be the extent to which the private sector thinks the country is serious about it, and the government or parliament is serious about it. And so it's not just climate policy today, but they can see a trajectory of where it's going, and therefore they invest accordingly. And then you get into that virtuous circle, and it's self-reinforcing.
Because if they don't believe the governments are serious about it, they won't make those investments.
Yeah, they'll wait, and then it'll be more painful. It'll be, you know, the change will have to be greater. Look, it all comes back to central banking, Anthony, in my world, and the issue in central banking is if you make early adjustments, then you don't have to make bigger adjustments later. And if people can see where you're going, you sometimes don't even have to, you know, you have to make very modest adjustments because they're pulling forward the future. It's, you know, it's more complicated in climate policy, but the same principle applies.
Yeah, and do you see, apart from the having a consistent message from governments there, are there other barriers to making this transition to what you're doing? What are the main challenges if you do your own risk analysis to making this happen?
I think it's, look, I mean, there are some technical barriers, right? I mean, the engineering out to 2030 is pretty good. In other words, it's pretty economic, and that sort of 30 to 40% reduction that's needed. You can see pathways to get to that. There are technological choke points. You know, carbon capture, use, and storage needs to become much more efficient. The hydrogen economy needs to move from concept to competitive. And some of that's scale, but some of it's also additional innovation, technological. The advantage, though, so those are, quote, barriers. And again, it depends on where you sit. There are other barriers or big opportunities, because the more that's a common understanding, the more people recognize, whether in finance or business, that that's where the economy needs to go. These are the problems that need to be solved. The more money that gets put behind those, you know, the various ways of solutions, and the more things go. If you, and I'll give you an example. The estimates I've seen that the money put behind carbon capture, direct air carbon capture, is about 1/1000th of that which has been put behind storage, battery storage in the last 10 years. Okay, we made huge, or others have made huge progress in storage. Is now very economic, part of the solution. Well, this needs to be part of the solution. Unfortunately, it's not the silver bullet, but part of the solution. But if you can see that, you can see the big return that that would come from it.
Okay, that's great. I think we're going to, with only 3 minutes to 2, so we're going to wind up there and just say thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know, in Canada, I don't know whether you've had breakfast yet or not, but thank you very much for your time. It's an absolutely fascinating oversight, and good luck with your work on the COP26. And we'll be following it closely. I might approach you for an update at some time. And thank you all, everyone, for tuning in as well. As I said, we've got an exciting program of events over the next year, and we'll send around more details for that. So, Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you all, and good luck.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Aye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.